The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, good morning. Good morning. Hopefully, thankfully, for those of you that have joined, my name is Preston Bucati. I'm an attorney and consultant with IT Governance USA, and this morning we're going to be talking about the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. It's a new draft certification scheme that's put on by the U.S. Department of Defense. It's going to become a requirement for all prime and subcontractors who do business with the Department of Defense starting this summer. So we'll be discussing that new certification scheme a little bit today, trying to break down the different levels, the different requirements. And again, I just wanted to say thank you for joining. We might wait 30 more seconds or so just to let some other folks dial in. I know as folks shift from webinar to webinar while we're all working from home these days, you may need to grab coffee or refill tea. So we'll just give folks about 30 more seconds before diving in too much further. Again, just to say thank you for joining. My name's Preston Bucati, and we've got some good content ahead. So with that, I'll go ahead and actually get started with more of an in-depth introduction. Like I said, my name's Preston Bucati. I'm a consultant and attorney with IT Governance USA, so my background is in law and policy implementation. I've written some books, although I have to say that anybody will let you write a book if you pay them enough money. But there are books out there. I've written a book on the CCPA, that's the California Consumer Privacy Act. It's an implementation guide that tries to break down that law and teach you how to roll out a compliance privacy program. So hopefully some of those same principles, for those of you that have read that book, maybe for those of you that haven't, a lot of those same principles would apply to this topic. It's just a different set of requirements, right? And so to that end, I teach a lot of training and certification courses, not only on laws like GDPR in the European Union or CCPA here in the States, but also those respective risk management frameworks like ISO or NIST or SIS-20, you know, the various cybersecurity controls you can put in place to build a program that not only manages these issues, reduces legal liability and risk to your business, but also demonstrates compliance to regulatory bodies and business partners, right? So today's agenda, we're going to be discussing the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or draft CMMC, like I said. And to get us going, we've actually got a poll. So for those of you that are familiar with GoToWebinar, we've got a poll on the right-hand side of the screen. And the poll is asking if you are a U.S. government contractor. I'd be curious to know, because ultimately that's what this new scheme applies to, right? And so you'll see we're going to dive into this scheme, a breakdown of what exactly it is, including the various levels and processes and capability domains. And then I'm going to turn and try to break down and understand, okay, how do you get audited to this scheme? How do you actually demonstrate that you're meeting a certain level, the level that may be required of you by various U.S. government bodies? And from there, we'll go into key steps to compliance, right? What you can start doing to prepare now. Like I said, the Department of Defense has indicated that these requirements will start appearing in government contracts this summer. They're going to phase in over June and July. But presumably by the fall, depending on, I guess, on COVID and everything else, but presumably by the fall, this will phase in entirely and will start to become a full government requirement. So to that end, if you've got questions over the course of this presentation, please feel free to email them out. We've got our Service Center email right there that will send it to my questions box, and I'll address those at the end of the webinar. We'll also be sending out some materials after, right? Handouts are available with slides for those that have attended. And I'll do my best to actually, you know, depending on the number and type of questions, consider sending out something to all of you with maybe more in-depth responses, depending on how much time. As you guys know, sometimes with these meetings, you only have a couple of minutes. So if there are a lot of questions, we'll type out some responses and make sure they all get to you so you've got all your questions answered. So what is the draft CMMC? A quick and important point to note is the wording draft, right? You'll see that laced throughout this presentation, and that's a requirement coming from the government. The basic concept is, hey, they're still kind of working this out. So that's something to keep in the back of your mind as we talk about the CMMC over the course of the rest of this morning, is that this is not 100% ironed out quite yet. A lot of the details are still being perfected, especially the organization and orchestration of the audit scheme, right? The accreditation board is working to select third-party organizations that have been vetted and accredited. But for what it's worth, and this is all available from the DoD, they have started to figure out exactly what the scheme will look like and breaking down those levels. But here, this slide is trying to demonstrate why we are in this position, right? The basic concept, and it's quite interesting to see as the poll results come in, it seems like a majority of you guys are not US government contractors, although there is a hearty subcategory of attendees here that are. What I would remind you to consider is that doing business with the United States government is a supply chain, right? And so even if your business partner is not the United States government, you may be supplying someone who is in turn supplying the United States government. And so you may have contractual flow down obligations that you may not even really know about, right? And that's ultimately the issue. The issue is that over the past couple of years, as the US government has come up with new security requirements in order to protect our infrastructure, our national security, they've ultimately come to the realization that people aren't doing a very good job of following the rules. As it stands right now, anybody here that has indicated that they are a US government contractor, you're already obligated to follow some of the security controls found in the NIST documents. And presumably on the course we're talking about here as it relates to defense information, we'd be focusing specifically on NIST 171. And so that's ultimately the deal. Hey, a lot of these requirements have been around for a number of years now, but people aren't doing a great job of following them. That's a giant risk when it comes to the security of the United States government and its citizenry, right? So the Department of Defense is trying to come up with a new scheme in order to assess cybersecurity in the supply chain so that they can have their own guarantees and assurances that data will actually be protected. So you see on the slide there that the CMC, it applies to contractors that are dealing with FCI or CUI. That's Federal Contract Information or Controlled Unclassified Information. So again, whether you are receiving that directly from a US government entity, agency, department, what have you, or whether you are receiving it from a business supplier who in turn is receiving it from the government, you got to deal with these requirements, right? So it applies to prime contractors and subcontractors. And you see, like I said, this model is based on existing best practices. Hopefully for everybody on the webinar today, this isn't something that's totally new, totally scary, right? This is based on existing best practices that are found in industry and internationally accepted cybersecurity frameworks. You see a list on the slide there, right? ISO 27001, 27032, both of the NIST materials along with the UK Cyber Essentials. What has happened is that this US Department of Defense, along with the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Accreditation Board, bit of a mouthful, otherwise known as the CMMC they've sort of swizzled all of these security standards together to try to create a multi-tiered, multifaceted, multi-level security certification scheme, right? So you see at the bottom of the slide, we're talking about 171 different practices or controls spread across 5 different levels that are also aligned to 5 different maturity levels to hopefully better assess and quantify the technical capabilities of US government prime contractors and subcontractors. Right? And so what you'll start to see, moving away from this idea of self-assessment and self-attestation, the US government is going to start to mandate that you meet one of these 5 levels, depending on the type of data you deal with, and they're going to come in and actually do an accredited audit, right? So a third-party organization is going to come to your company and audit you regularly to make sure you are meeting those levels, right? For those of you that are familiar with the ISO methodology, that would be used to you, or you would be used to that, excuse me, right? This continual audit cycle. But again, right, NIST has historically been a little bit more self-attestation. For all intents and purposes, the Department of Defense is just going to take this a little bit more seriously. So what does the draft CMMC actually look like? Well, let's break it down. Like I said, we've got 5 levels, 171 different practices. And so I like this graphic because it helps you to try to understand the different tiered structure. You see that level 1 is understood as basic cyber hygiene, right? It's really the beginning stage And that's why it only involves 17 different practices. But level 2 builds on top of those with 55 additional practices to try to give you a level of intermediate cyber hygiene, right? A level of sort of basic cyber hygiene. And from there, we graduate to level 3, which is good cyber hygiene. Now, something to consider as you see these colored gradations on the chart, you have to think back to the slide I just showed you, right? ISO 27001, NIST 800, 171 or 153, or excuse me, 171 or 53, various levels of the CMMC equate to other cybersecurity standards, right? So the Department of Defense has basically already said, hey, if you are meeting level 3 of the CMMC, that will equate to NIST 800, 171. In fact, it's actually going to take you a little bit above because, as you can see, there's some additional practices involved. Whereas ISO 27001 is going to get you about 90% of the way to level 3, right? So you can see obviously then level 4 and level 5 a bit more advanced as we build on top of those with additional practices. Now, the other interesting sort of layer to this, the lens perhaps, is that within those practices, you've got 17 capability domains. So I'm going to align this to the ISO methodology for those of you familiar with it. Think of it very much like the Annex A controls, right? We've got control categories and we've got controls themselves. So a spread across these 171 different practices, they can be subdivided into these 17 different capability domains or, basically categories you see on the left, right? And those are going to align to a lot of the topics you would see in NIST and ISO, right? Access control, incident response, risk management, awareness and training, audit and accountability, physical protection, configuration management, system integrity, communications, etc. Right? You can see how they've tried to break these down into different buckets. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, you see here that what they've got going is they're trying to align the process level or practice level. You see that on the right? Basic cyber hygiene all the way up to advanced. They're aligning that with an understanding of process maturity, right? So the idea is that, hey, it's not just that you are implementing these controls, there's also a level of maturity within which the controls are implemented, right? Are they simply performed? Or are they documented and performed, right? From there, are they actively managed? Are they then reviewed to build in that layer of continual improvement, again, for the ISO folks in the room, and then optimization, right? That's that idea that we are constantly cycling this process to improve it over time. It's not just something we do, it's something we do repeatedly. It's documented so others can do it. We manage and review that process and the documentation involved so that we can continue to improve the process, right? So like, as I've said, they've tried to blend together various existing cybersecurity standards to create this certification scheme. So you're going to get certified based on one of the 5 levels. But as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, for example, it could be that you are not able to advance to level 3, good cyber hygiene, if you cannot demonstrate that your practices or the implementation of your controls is at that managed maturity level, right? Simply doing them won't be enough to reach level 3. You're going to have to go a step further. So hopefully this is all making sense to you guys, right? We've got a number of different security controls, right? Be they people, process, or technology. There's various things we can do to try to build defense and depth around our organization and the information we process. But it's not just the straight implementation of security controls. We also have to manage those controls competently and successfully so that they continue to get better. The fundamental point is that, hey, cybersecurity is a moving target, right? There are constant new threats. There are constant new vulnerabilities. There are constant new disasters and weaknesses being thrown at us, right? COVID is a perfect example. The number of cybersecurity incidents that have spiked as a result of people working from home, looking for news and information from government websites, right? Payment protection plans, small business loans. There's a lot of opportunity for nefarious actors to insert themselves into our economy and suck some money out using phishing techniques, spamming techniques, right? Malware, Trojans, ransomware, etc. And so the Department of Defense has understood that, and they're trying to build more of a risk-based methodology that incorporates an understanding of process maturity to hopefully build and enhance the cybersecurity posture of the United States government. Now, for those of you that are a little more cheeky in the room, you might wonder, hey, what have we been doing for the past couple of years, right? Well, I think that's why we've seen breaches in different government entities like the IRS or the Office of Management and Budget, right? And so as this threat continues to evolve and be manipulated by third parties, organized crime or nation state actors, all of us in the United States and abroad, because this is not just applicable to US citizens and corporations, this applies to businesses doing business with the United States government and processing US government data, right? So these businesses could be located in France, Israel, Asia, wherever. And so you see kind of this nice breakdown here, swizzling this all together, excuse me. So you see, right, level 1 is equivalent to compliance with the practices found in FAR's clauses 48 CFR 52204, right? And like I said earlier, by the time you graduate to level 3 maturity, you have hopefully encompassed all of the practices found in NIST 800-171, but you've actually probably gone a step further, right? You see at the bottom, that includes an additional 20 practices that support good cyber hygiene, right? So level 2 and level 3 is sort of that intermediate level where you're advancing through ISO 27001, you're building out the controls from NIST. As you reach levels 4 and 5, that's a little bit more of a graduated category. So presumably levels 4 and 5 would apply to organizations that are processing that sort of controlled, classified information from the government. But it remains to be seen, we'll have to see how the Department of Defense rolls out these requirements in their RFPs and what the ultimate breakdown is across company categorization to better understand what statistically is the most likely level to aim for, right? And so for those of you that are not current government contractors, that type of data may be helpful for you to understand what level of compliance you should reach in order to potentially win new business from the United States government, right? Potentially trillions of dollars of money there. Or perhaps it's also just an understanding of, hey, what's good cyber hygiene versus basic cyber hygiene, right? And so if you are just starting your cyber compliance journey, this might be a nice framework for you to help bring a level of understanding, right? Because as we all know, cybersecurity can't be built overnight. It's cyclical and it has to improve continually over time. So this sort of graduated stepping stone understanding will hopefully help you build a compliance regime where you can start with the basics, but over time try to improve to get up to that advanced level, right? And you see on the right-hand side of the slide that by the time you've reached level 5, you will have incorporated all 171 practices. You will comply with the FAR's requirements. You will comply with NIST 800-171. You, in theory, will have a fully sufficient ISO 27001 program, and you've probably even gone a bit above that, including some practices from NIST special publications and draft publications, and other additional controls that the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Accreditation Board and the agency have found and put together, right? And you see on the bottom of levels 4 and 5, that's up to potentially 26 additional controls outside of what we find in the FAR's clauses, what we find in NIST, and what we find in ISO. So then, that is a quick rundown of the structure and breakdown of this certification scheme, right? So basically what's going to happen is the government is going to say, hey, you need to meet one of these 5 levels. Okay, how do you do that? How do you demonstrate that? Well, what you're going to have to do is align yourself to an accredited assessment scheme. Again, for those of you familiar with ISO, this will be very, very familiar, because what is currently going on, you see there on the left, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Accreditation Board, the CMMC AB, is working to create a formal accreditation scheme. This is the group that's working with the DoD and industry members on various subcommittees to which IT governance is applied, to try to understand, hey, exactly how is this going to roll out and apply in the real world, right? It's great that we've thought of all these requirements in theory in our boardrooms in Washington, D.C., but how's it actually going to work for companies out there in practice? So the CMMC AB is responsible for training and certifying 3PAOs. Those are third-party accredited organizations. So at the top level, we'll have this accreditation board who's setting the rules based on input from the government, based on input from industry, and they're going to develop an understanding to train and certify accredited training bodies. Those 3PAOs, right? The organizations that are able to, number one, perform audits and assessments, but then number two, also able to in turn offer training to you. Because here's the thing. 3PAOs can be an entity organization, but there can also be accredited auditors, right? So an accredited auditor would work for an accredited audit organization. That organization can in turn teach others how this assessment scheme works, how the audit process works, how they can do audits, and then in turn what they need to do to meet the various levels of the CMMC, right? So right now, as it stands, we've got various working parties and subcommittees under the CMMC AB working with those industry members to come up with some of this stuff, right? Trying to come up with the accreditation scheme, the training materials, the audit materials, etc., so that by the time this rolls out this summer, there will be a hearty number of available, ready 3PAOs who can come to your organization and perform these assessments, right? Perform the formal certification scheme assessment, determine what level you are at, and then give you that certificate so that you can turn around and go back to either your business partner or the US government and apply for that bid and win the money and you know, take the contract. So that's where things stand currently right now. You see there is, at least based on the CMMC AB marketing material, there is at least right now what appears to be a sort of seal of approval you see right in the middle of the screen. That is taken from the Department of Defense. That's not an IT governance logo. So presumably, much like we see with ISO certificates, this will become sort of a certification scheme where you could put this logo on your website or other business materials and thereby indicate to business partners, hey, I've got a mature cybersecurity program in place, right? If you give me your data, it will be protected. And not only that, if you want to pursue business with the United States government, no issue from my end, right? Because I will be a perfect supplier to you. We've already met the flow down requirements. So something again to consider for those of you that are familiar with ISO, right? This goes back to that two-tiered accreditation and certification scheme, presumably regular site visits to ensure that ongoing compliance is maintained so that that certificate is still valid, right? You see there's certainly probably going to be a 3-year audit renew cycle. So prepare for that, right? The idea, again, is that we are moving away from the self-attestation that's currently found under NIST and moving more towards the formal accreditation and audit scheme that's found under ISO. So in terms of what you need to do to get a certification, I think there are some things you need to start thinking about now in order to prepare yourself for the requirements we already know about and other requirements that will be presumably rolling out over the course of this summer and this fall, right? So like I said, the CMMC is going to become a requirement over the next 5 years. It's going to be phased in more and more and more. It's going to start appearing this summer as a requirement for existing contracts and new contracts. And over time, the DoD is assuming that over that 5-year period, that gives enough people to be phased in, right? Hey, your contract signed last year didn't require it, but the new one will. So by the time we reach 2026, all of us in the United States that are doing business with the Department of Defense and the United States government will have a certification in place, right? Now you'll see here the next bullet point, and this is the reason I've said draft throughout the period of this webinar, is that this rulemaking period is in a bit of state of flux, right? according to the CMMC AB, the rulemaking period was going to continue and somewhat sort of formalize and crystallize during this spring. Obviously, the entire world is in a tizzy with the COVID pandemic, so the timing of that is a bit up in the air. I would not be surprised if that gets bumped maybe a month to 6 weeks. Do not take that as a blank check or get out of jail free card. It is my understanding in conversations with local regulatory bodies in my state. I live in Denver, Colorado, and participate regularly with small business groups in my municipality and at the state level. I also participate regularly in the California legislative process by virtue of the CCPA materials. Guys, people are still enforcing the laws in light of COVID, right? We are not putting everything on pause to deal with this pandemic because the rule of law in this country has to continue. So whether I'm talking about privacy compliance issues, which are starting to be enforced now, we've already seen litigation go out, or whether I'm talking about the CMMC, do not think that just because your business has been upended by the pandemic, that the United States government is going to be sympathetic to that issue. We have all had 6 to 8 weeks to deal with this. The curve, we can argue over whether it has been flattened, but you cannot argue that the sun is going to rise tomorrow. So this is our Darwinian moment for some businesses. You need to manage disaster recovery and business continuity related to COVID, along with continuing obligations, because what you need to remember, especially as it relates to the CMMC, many of these requirements are coming from NIST 800-171. Many of these requirements have been in place for the past 2 years. COVID appeared last fall, but NIST 800-171 has been around for a while. So if you're not meeting requirements today, you need to drop what you're doing and go do that, right? As soon as the webinar is over, pick up the phone, give me a shout. Let's put a plan in place because you need to meet existing contractual requirements, right? You're already violating a contract. Your new contract is going to build in the CMMC scheme. So I just want to emphasize that again. I understand that COVID has sort of thrown the past couple of months up in the air. There's a lot of economic uncertainty about the rest of the year, but many in the United States government, Department of Justice, have indicated, hey, you know what, you've had 6 weeks, it's time to get back to business, and we're gonna come back at you with fines and regulatory enforcement. I would assume we are going to see this as well. Of course, as you can imagine, Department of Defense, national security, military, critical infrastructure, this is an important issue. So the Department of Defense, and I say that with emphasis, is certainly going to take this seriously. So if you are interested in pursuing business with the United States government, or if your business partners are demanding a level of cybersecurity maturity, whether it's through current compliance with NIST or ISO, CIS 20, UK Cyber Essentials, or if you just want to get your house in order, start to think along the lines of this CMMC scheme. It's not outside the realm of possibility that this will be adopted by various other state laws. We've seen them in California, New York, Nevada, Washington, and others that are trying to implement new cybersecurity requirements on businesses, right? So we see in the CCPA, there's this idea that you have to have reasonable security, quote unquote. What does that mean exactly? Well, the New York Shield Act that was implemented in March, right before all of COVID went down, that actually had 17 requirements for cybersecurity. So I would assume that as more states come out with cybersecurity laws in the absence of a federal law, which realistically is not likely going to happen this year in light of everything else going on, that it would be assumed that either local agencies or business partners, and by that I mean your suppliers, your vendors, your customers, your legal team, or your insurance providers, are going to start to ask for an articulated and crystallized understanding of cybersecurity maturity, right? And ultimately, coming from a guy like me, a lawyer, I want to know how much pain you are going to cause me. How much am I going to have to write in a checkbook when you inevitably have a data breach, right? Because data breaches happen. It's not a matter of if, but when. So, hey, I'm trying to understand my liability. Okay, well, the more we can all build out an understanding of maturity, implementing controls, we can all protect data, increase cybersecurity, comply with requirements. Hey, you get the legal team off your back. That's 90% of the battle in my experience. So again, even if you are not a US government contractor, it's not unwise to start to prepare for some of this stuff. You see that it's going to be expected in RFIs by June of this year, maybe a window of cushion, pushing that to July with everything going on with COVID. But as you can see, right, this is going to start to be a mandated requirement in RFPs later this fall. So if you're looking to sign any new contracts with the United States government later this year, prepare for the CMMC. Now, what are your next steps then? Hopefully I've tried to talk around this topic a little bit, trying to articulate, hey, what can you do to start to prepare and get an understanding? Well, first, determine a framework to guide your cyber risk. Like I said, this is not new. These are based on existing requirements, and a lot of companies that we deal with have come around to ISO in recent years because it's increasingly being asked by their business partners, right? So even though they don't do business with the United States government, as an example, they may do business with a Fortune 500 entity. And that Fortune 500 company may ask for a cybersecurity certification of some kind. So if you're not doing anything today, I would say go look at existing materials and start to align yourself to a framework or a scheme that's already out there, right? Try to figure out where exactly you are. It's kind of like going to the store and trying on a couple of different shirts. Am I a medium? Am I a large? Start to understand where you are today. To that end, you want to implement controls and start to evolve towards process maturity. So like I said, and if you'll remember from these slides, right, that the levels of the CMMC are not just based on a pure recital of implementation of cybersecurity controls, right? It's also an element of how mature you have those controls implemented. Are they simply performed? Are they documented? Two, are they actually managed, reviewed, and optimized over time? So that's step one, is you need to implement some sort of cybersecurity, right? You need to put up the walls of defense. Step two is build a level of process maturity, because it's not just enough to build something. All of us who's ever done a home improvement project knows that you build something, but over time it falls apart, right? You got to go back to Home Depot. So get your cybersecurity defenses up, keep them maintained. From there, perform a gap analysis to determine whether additional controls are needed, right? Once you've built that layer of security and you've got it continually maintained, now you can start to understand, okay, hey, we've got a handle on where we're supposed to be today. Where do we need to be tomorrow? And what do we need to do to close those gaps, right? So I do say, most people I think would traditionally say start with a gap analysis, but I think there's a little bit of self-reflection involved in this process. There's no point in jumping straight to a CMMC gap analysis if you don't have any cybersecurity frameworks or controls in place today, right? And you saw a couple slides ago, there already is an articulated understanding. And like I said earlier, you'll get these slides after the presentation, but there's already an understanding of, hey, if you can meet ISO 27001, or if you can meet NIST 800-171, that may push you towards a certain CMMC level. So I would start with those requirements, then understand what level of the CMC you are at, and then determine what level of the CMMC you need to be at and what do you need to do, right? A very perfect, clear example, if you implemented NIST 800-171 because you went back through your contracts and found that that was a requirement from years ago and you never really done it, so oops, we got to clean this up. Okay, great, that's done. Well, you've implemented NIST 800-171. Guess what? You are almost at CMMC level 3, right? So depends on what you would need to do. If you need level 3, you'd have to do additional work. If you only needed level 2, you'd probably be done. So from there, once you've determined what level of the CMMC you are going to need, and presumably that's more of a business need, once you make that determination, you can then schedule an audit. That audit can be used obviously as a part of the accreditation scheme to demonstrate your compliance, demonstrate your contract eligibility, and like I said, perhaps just demonstrate to other business partners that you've got a level of mature cyber management and risk management in place at the company to deal with data governance issues, data privacy issues, and data security issues. So, resources and support. As you can imagine, IT governance has a variety of topics and tools available to help you along this journey. And I don't know if you've picked it up by now, but I'm a bit of a cybersecurity nerd. So even if you just want to reach out and talk to this stuff, give me a shout. Maybe we can have a virtual beer and talk about these things. But there's a variety of things we can do to help you on the journey. Like I said earlier, if you are considering a alignment to a cybersecurity standard, right? Maybe you are not a US government contractor, and so you don't think you will be required to have a CMMC certification. Still not a bad idea to try to align yourself to a framework, right? And what I would tell you there, without going down a legal wormhole, is as more laws come out in the United States, they are increasingly putting the onus of compliance and the onus of demonstrating compliance onto the plaintiff, or excuse me, onto the defendant, right? So if the California Attorney General drags you into a courtroom, you are going to have to prove why your security is good enough for the data at issue and the risks at issue. Now, you basically have two choices there. When you're standing in the courtroom, you can get all sweaty in your sport coat as the judge grills you, or you can pull out a certificate that's internationally recognized and renowned as good security, right? CMMC or ISO. So if you don't think the CMMC strictly applies to you, you may consider a lighter version, right? Consider implementing something like ISO 27001 to get you to that sort of level of managed and good cyber hygiene. You could also look at existing NIST frameworks like the NIST CSF, that's the NIST cybersecurity framework. There's also the PCF, the Privacy Compliance Framework. Now, this topic is more focused on security, as you can imagine, but perhaps swizzling some of those together or picking up some of the controls from NIST 853 will march you along this path, right, as you start to graduate more toward NIST 800-171. In the United Kingdom, and for those of you doing business internationally, you may consider the UK Cyber Essentials. That's a little bit more of a quick and easy way to pick up some cybersecurity controls and demonstrate your alignment to an internationally understood framework for compliance. So the difference between those, obviously, is that things like NIST are a little bit more self-attestation. You have to pick it up and run with it, whereas ISO involves a layer of external third-party audits. There are pros and cons to each, as you can imagine, right? On the one hand, running around and implementing controls under NIST is easier for you to do. In turn, then, though, your business partners have to trust that you have implemented those controls with the level of maturity you are saying you did, right? It's the reason the CMMC was developed, is to bring that certification into play. So that's the difference between NIST and ISO, is ISO is going to say, hey, great, it's cool that you've told us you've implemented all of these things, but now we need to validate that and prove it, right? That phrase out there, trust but verify. So ISO has that audit scheme built into place. In turn, that means you're going to be audited. The benefit of that, though, is you're going to get a certificate that shows you're meeting the requirements. So it's hopefully a little bit easier to cruise through the contracting or vendor selection process if you're trying to win a bid with either, you know, suppliers, business partners, or anyone up your chain. Certificate is a lot easier to do as opposed to filling out a 200-question Excel spreadsheet asking about your cybersecurity posture, right? So that's why I say step one is to implement an existing framework. Start to align yourself with a good understanding in industry best practice today, and from there you can align yourself to the CMMC maturity model and see what you need to do to close the gaps, right? To that end, some of this is going to involve elements of contract review. Like I said, I often find this an experience, and it may be just my anecdotal experience, but many companies are actually unaware of the contractual obligations that they sign up and agree to, right? You know, if you're chasing business with a Fortune 500 company, they're going to send you a 40-page document that's drafted by a team of attorneys. And I can tell you, as somebody who's been on one of those teams, that yes, I do try to make things complicated, and I try to put it in as small as font as possible, so that hopefully you don't read it, you skip over it, you sign it, and you're on the hook for a bunch of stuff, right? That is, again, why we are in the position we're in today, because Although a prime contractor may understand, hey, look at all these requirements I need to meet for the United States government, everybody else in the supply chain may not be as aware. So for those of you on the poll that indicated that you are not a government contractor, I would cautiously advise you to go double check that. You may be a government contractor, you just don't know it yet. And so you may have US government, either agency, department, or Department of Defense data sitting on your servers or your implementation and instances of things on Amazon or Azure servers. And so you may be violating contractual agreements today, right now. That's a liability you need to go clean up and fix. From there, you can start to put in good security, and from there, you can worry about the CMMC. So what else can you do on this topic to get ready? Stay tuned, right? And that's why the last bullet on this slide is around training and awareness. IT governance currently offers a variety of sort of foundation and awareness trainings, all the way up to graduated certification trainings around IT and cybersecurity. Definitely a good thing to get if you are sitting on this webinar thinking to yourself, holy cow, I have no idea what he's talking about, right? Start to get yourself aware so that you can in turn go back to your company and spread the word, right? You need to become an evangelist for cybersecurity. You've already taken the steps to join the webinar. You got to get everyone else at the company to take it seriously, right? The other thing I will tell you, although I'm not authorized to put it on the slide, IT governance is in conversations with the accreditation board as it stands now, right? I at the very least talk to them at least about once a week. So we are in the process of becoming an accredited training and audit organization. So although we cannot offer it today, right now, please do stay tuned, because we can try to teach your staff how to prepare for these audits, how to comply with various levels of the CMMC. We can teach you to become an accredited auditor if that's your business model and you're looking to learn more about that. And then, of course, we can come in and do the audits on your behalf and build that relationship for you between the Department of Defense and all that business opportunity they have, right? Those trillions of dollars, and your small business that's looking to grow, survive, and thrive, especially in light of the current COVID situation, right? We've seen that the government's got some money to help keep us going, but we all need to try to do what we can to take advantage of that and get through the next 18 months. I like to think for those of us that come out the other end, we'll be stronger than ever. So please don't take this as another set of compliance obligations. This is a chance for you to grow, evolve, and mature. And in that process, it's a chance for you to beat everyone else in your industry. Like I said earlier, we're going through a bit of a Darwinian moment right now. If you can manage cyber compliance issues along with greater business continuity issues, you're looking at a pipeline with potential $1 trillion of revenue come this fall. All you got to do is get through the summer, right? So like I said, use this as an opportunity. This is not just another compliance requirement. This is a chance for you to beat your competitors, to do it better than them, and be first to market to take advantage of either government and Department of Defense business opportunities, or at the very least, evolving understanding of cybersecurity in the United States to help get business opportunities more generally. So with that, I'm cognizant that we are closing on about 15 minutes to the top of the hour. So I'm going to take a chance here and open the mic up for questions, comments, and concerns. I'm seeing here, give me 1 second, guys, as I go through these. What requirement will be required for CUI versus FCI? Great question. So bear with me, guys. I'm going to flip back on the slides. You'll remember that on this slide, right, the CMMC is measuring a contractor's ability to safeguard FCI or CUI. Those are types of data you would receive from the government. So the way this would typically work is when you are filling out an RFI or an RFP with a government agency, they're going to outline specifically what types of data is going to be coming your way. In turn, presumably, as a part of that contract or service level agreement, they're going to say, hey, here's what level of the CMMC we expect you to meet with regard to that information. So I apologize, I don't have a straight answer for you right now. That will probably be something that exists on the RFPs. And again, that's why I think it's incumbent on you, to prepare now, right? Start to get aligned to a CMMC level today, because you don't want to be caught off guard, right? These RFPs maybe only give you a month or 2 months to respond. So if your plan is to wait until you see what the requirements are, you're going to be at least 2 months behind several other people who are trying to submit and win that bid, right? So like I said, you don't want to find yourself this October where a government agency says, hey, we've got a contract, please bid for it, we need someone to meet level 3, and you say, okay, cool, let's get ready. There's going to be plenty of people that are already at level 3 and they're filling out the application. So start to get aligned to a level today, build your understanding of maturity, and then if a requirement that comes out that's different, you can close a much smaller gap, right? Now, somebody else asked and they wanted me to clarify. I said earlier in the slides that ISO 27001 will get you about 90% of the way to CMMC level 3. That is not the gospel. That's the gospel according to Preston. That's my understanding looking through these controls, participating in some of these webinars and the materials from the CMMC AB. You know, that is not necessarily 100% guarantee, but that's my understanding in doing ISO implementations, talking with existing ISO bodies, talking with the CMMC AB. If you are already certified to ISO 27001 and you actively maintain that certificate, yes, you are probably about 90% of the way towards CMMC level 3. What you would need to do is go through and do a bit of a gap analysis comparing ISO 27001 to NIST 800-171, right? So you're going to need to say, hey, how many controls from NIST have I implemented? Once you've done all of those, you see on the slide, you're going to have 20 more to do. So that's why, you know, hey, if you do ISO 27001, you're probably doing most of NIST. There's going to be a tiny little gap, but it remains to be seen exactly what that gap is quantified as. I would just take it as a rule of thumb that that's about a 90% mark. So if you are already ISO certified, you're certainly in a good position, better than most. If you're not ISO certified and you don't know if CMMC will be a requirement, I would advise you very much from a personal perspective, professional issues aside, start to look at an ISO certificate. We're seeing that become a lot more of a contracting requirement just in general business. And I have had to have unfortunate, difficult conversations with a lot of small business clients who are basically cut out of work because they cannot demonstrate cybersecurity, right? They're trying to do business with Johnson & Johnson or General Electric or some, you know, insert any number of companies with a large law firm. They get hit with a 200 question Excel spreadsheet or, you know, reams of legal documents, and it just overwhelms them. And like I said, it's kind of a Darwinian moment. This is the way the world is moving. You need to be able to demonstrate cyber compliance, and I can understand it's a burden, but yeah, that's all I can tell you. And it goes back to the lawyers like me who just want to understand who's got what in terms of liability. So yeah, for another question is rolled in, what does ISO cost? Depends on the size of your organization. I would tell you it also depends on the audit body that you select, right? So IT governance works as an ISO consultant. Happy to tell you all the tips and tricks to get through an audit. As a result of that, though, I can't actually do the audits, right? Because I'm the guy whispering in your ear, hey, here's what you got to do. So from my experience in doing ISO implementations, the cheapest I've seen ISO certification is around $15,000. It obviously goes up from there. Again, it largely depends on the size of your company, the scope of what's being certified, and then from there it's the certification body. You know, how much do they charge for audits? Many of them are doing virtual audits right now. I know Perry Johnson, Coal Fire here in Denver, Colorado is doing virtual audits. So they have adapted to doing things in light of everything else going on in the world. Maybe there's an opportunity for some discounts if you're considering ISO audits and the dollar number is what's putting you off. I would say reach out to certification bodies right now and engage them in a discussion around pricing. See if you can't worm your way into a deal just because, hey, the ISO auditor is not going to fly out and come on site. So maybe that's some ways to save money. Now, someone else has asked, how do I do a NIST audit? That is a little trickier. Like I said, NIST is currently somewhat of a self-attestation scheme. In doing NIST 800-171 last fall, I can tell you that you can be sort of audited by a ATO, an authorized trade organization, if I'm remembering that acronym correctly off the top of my head. So what I would tell you is it's the same but different. ISO and presumably the CMMC are going to have this formal audit scheme where an external third-party auditor is going to come on site regularly, submit reports to maintain a certificate. NIST is more of a list of controls that you've got to try to implement, and then you've got to demonstrate to the government entity how you're doing a good job. As you can imagine, it's a little bit more legwork. The government doesn't really have the time or energy to do that, and that's why they've shifted to this accreditation and audit scheme, because they just want to say, hey, we need level 4. If you're not level 4, get out of line, right? I don't want to sit and review your practices. I don't want to look at your risk assessment. You're either level 4 or you're not. So if you're already aligned to the NIST framework and you've already got controls in place, I would say run with that, use this slide, and try to figure out where you would fall on the CMMC tier structure. And then from there, you can determine what else you might need to do to meet a certain level if you have to. Now, someone else has asked, what if you don't meet a certain level? I will fully admit that I'm not 100% sure, but I would bet dollars to donuts you're not going to be even considered for a bid for government work, right? That's just my assumption, that the reason they moved towards this scheme is to say, hey, we need level 3. And if you're at level 1, well, too bad, so sad, right? If you're at level 2, maybe you can engage them in a discussion. I don't know that they will have the time or energy. So again, I would say, I think if you are under a requirement to meet a certain CMMC level, you should work really, really hard to meet that level. If not, I would prepare a pretty darn good reason as to why you cannot. I would include a game plan on when you're going to do it. And I would be prepared for the bad news that says, too bad, so sad. So yeah, I think that a lot of that kind of remains to be seen as to how this rolls out in the actual marketplace. But it's going to be a new government requirement, and I can bet that they're going to take this quite seriously. So with that, there are no other questions that have at least rolled in now, but you guys have variety of contact information on this slide. You've also got my information on the slide earlier. I'm a pretty easy guy to find on LinkedIn and the internet as well, so don't hesitate to reach out to me if you've got questions, comments, concerns on this topic. Like I said, I'm a cybersecurity nerd, so if you want, you can reach out to me day or night. I'm happy to talk to you, or as I offer to my current clients, if you ever need somebody to put you to sleep, just give me a shout on Friday night. I'm probably reading some legislation, and I'm happy to explain it to you. But to that end, right, I'm partly joking. I like this stuff. So if you are sitting here thinking, gosh, this is too much time and effort, hand it over to the people that like it, right? You know, happy to talk to you, happy to help explain and try to find the solution that fits you best based on the poll data that came in, right? This isn't totally applicable to everybody, and that's fine. What I would tell you from my experience, though, is that more and more companies are trying to define a articulated understanding of cybersecurity, right? As they sign contracts with business partners, they want assurances that those business partners are not going to create liability on their behalf through a data breach, right? They're basically trying to avoid a Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal, right? Cambridge Analytica had the breach, but who was the one that had to go to Congress? It was Mark Zuckerberg. So more and more companies are trying to say, hey, before we give you our data or before you touch our data, we want to know how good your security is. Now, sometimes you can engage in a lengthy back and forth with an army of lawyers. And again, I'm happy to help you with that, but that's typically not very fun. The alternate would be able to say, hey, look, we meet a certain standard. It's industry best practice, and you can either take it or leave it. And I tell you what, most of the time, those attorneys are going to take it. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. I appreciate those of you that have joined. I especially appreciate the engagement and questions. My name is Preston Bucati. I work with IT Governance USA, and we are happy to help you on your cyber compliance journey. Like I said earlier, stay tuned for more information as it relates to the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Scheme. This is still in its draft stages. A lot of wrinkles are being ironed out. It's going to start to roll out over the summer. If you've ever participated in the government rollout of anything, you know it typically is a little messy on the first go around. So we're going to probably have an evolving understanding of this over the course of June, July, August, and September. So what I would say, like I said, start to align yourself to a standard, get your ducks in a row at home, get your house in order, build up good security, start to evolve process maturity, and then figure out what level you want to be at and close that gap. So thank you for joining all, and we'll see you again on the next webinar that we have.